Clara edited some of the early drafts, of course, Julian had said earlier to the university dean, his tone carrying that light, dismissive warmth he reserved for domestic help. He had laughed, a soft, patronizing sound, as he patted my hand in front of the entire faculty senate, cementing my status as nothing more than a glorified copy editor for the masterpiece I had physically written from the first syllable to the last. Every person at this long mahogany table believed his lie, nodding politely at the supportive wife who kept his tea warm while he channeled the Muses. I could feel the heat rising in my collar, the urge to stand up and scream the truth into their self-righteous academic faces, clawing at my throat. But I forced my hands to remain perfectly still in my lap, choosing the silent, icy calculation of restraint over a scene. The condensation from my water glass had dripped onto the linen tablecloth, creating a damp, dark circle that slowly expanded toward Julian's hand. I watched the water sink into the heavy weave, millimeter by millimeter. Julian did not notice. He was speaking to Professor Holloway about the cadence of the third chapter, his left hand tracing a slow, theatrical arc in the air to emphasize his point. He always used that hand gesture when he talked about structure. It was a gesture he had adopted 3 years ago, around the time his second novel was nominated for the Regional Fiction Prize. I knew the cadence of that third chapter intimately. I had spent 4 consecutive nights in the study, surrounded by empty mugs of cold tea, restructuring its entire timeline because Julian's draft had left the protagonist stranded in a chronological dead end. Julian turned his head slightly, his smile wide and effortless. He leaned into my space, his shoulder brushing mine, though his eyes remained fixed on Holloway. Clara edited some of the early drafts, of course, he said, his tone warm and patronizingly appreciative. She is my first reader. Her eye for grammar is invaluable. Eleanor Holloway, sitting across from us, offered a polite, distant nod. "How wonderful to have a hobby you can share," she murmured, before returning her attention to her roasted duck. I did not correct him. I did not mention that first reader was a polite euphemism for the person who had spent 18 months translating his disjointed emotional outbursts into 340 pages of polished literary fiction. To argue would require me to explain the difference between editing a draft and writing it from scratch. It would require me to explain how Julian's original manuscript had been little more than 90 pages of scattered journal entries and half-formed dialogue. I calculated the energy required to explain this to Eleanor Holloway against the energy required to take another sip of my warm water. I chose the water. The restaurant, a dimly lit French bistro with dark wood paneling and the faint, sweet smell of burnt butter, was filled with the low murmur of 30 people who had come to celebrate Julian's success. It was a private room booked by his publisher. On the table, scattered among the wine glasses and half-eaten baskets of crusty bread, were 5 copies of the newly printed book, its dark blue cover catching the amber light of the candles. Julian reached down and picked up the copy resting near his plate. He stroked the matte finish of the cover with his thumb, a small, reverent movement. I looked at his hands. His fingernails were clean, manicured for the tour. My own hands were tucked under the table, the skin near my right index finger still dry and slightly calloused from hours of gripping a heavy pen while marking up his physical proofs. "I have a small surprise, actually," Julian announced, his voice carrying just enough to quiet the immediate circle of guests. He looked down the long table, past the editor, past the publicist, to the end where Genevieve sat. Genevieve was 24, a recent graduate of the creative writing program where Julian occasionally lectured. She had been hired 6 months ago to organize Julian's research files and manage his rising volume of correspondence. Tonight, she wore a high-necked, sage green dress that made her look remarkably fragile and academic. When Julian looked at her, her chin dipped, and she carefully adjusted the silver frame of her glasses. Julian opened the book, the fresh spine crackling slightly in the quiet of the room. "I have always believed that a book is not written in isolation," he said, his eyes scanning the table, lingering for a fraction of a second on mine before returning to Genevieve. "It requires a specific kind of light to guide the writer through the darkest parts of the narrative. A muse, if you will." He turned the page. I knew the layout of the front matter. I had designed the margins myself. "To Genevieve," Julian read, his voice dropping to a softer, more intimate register. "Who brought the light back to my pages and showed me the shore?" A quiet, collective murmur of appreciation rippled through the table. Eleanor Halloway smiled, her eyes darting quickly to me to gauge my reaction, then back to Julian. Genevieve looked down at her lap, her cheeks coloring with a delicate pink flush. I sat perfectly still. My fingers beneath the table remained loose, resting on my lap. The hum of the restaurant's ventilation system seemed to grow louder, a steady mechanical vibration that rattled the small metal hinges of the window behind us. It was a beautiful dedication. It was also a line I had written. 3 months ago, Julian had struggled with the final paragraph of the novel's epilogue. He had sat at his desk, head in his hands, complaining that he couldn't find the right image to close the story. I had sat on the floor beside his chair, my notebook on my knees, scratching out lines until I found the image of the shore, the light returning to the water. I had handed him the page. He had typed it into the master document without looking at me, his eyes already scanning the screen for the next paragraph. He had saved that line, my line, to dedicate the book to his assistant. Julian closed the book with a soft, decisive thud and set it back on the table. He picked up his wine glass and offered a toast to the table. "To the journey," he said. "To the journey," the guests echoed, their glasses clinking together in a disorganized chorus of crystal. Julian did not look at me to see if I had raised my glass. He knew I had not. He knew my glass was filled only with flat water and that I rarely drank during his events. He took a long sip of his Cabernet, his throat moving as he swallowed, his attention already captured by the editor sitting to his right, who was asking about his schedule for the upcoming television interview. I reached out and picked up the copy of the book Julian had just set down. The paper smelled of fresh ink and adhesive, a sharp chemical scent that overpowered the buttery aroma of the food. I opened the cover. The paper was heavy and cream-colored. I turned past the title page, past the copyright notice, to the single centered block of text on the 3rd page. To Genevieve, who brought the light back to my pages and showed me the shore. I touched the letters with the tip of my finger. The ink was slightly raised, dry and permanent. "Clara," Julian's voice cut through my thoughts, polite but firm. He didn't turn to look at me, but his hand reached out and tapped my wrist twice. "Could you pass the salt? The trout is a bit flat tonight." I looked at the small ceramic salt cellar sitting 3 inches from his left hand. It was well within his reach, but his hand remained open, waiting for me to pick it up and place it in his palm. I closed the book, set it down carefully on the edge of the table, and picked up the salt cellar. I placed it in his hand. "Thank you, darling," he said, without looking up from his conversation with the editor. I watched him sprinkle the white crystals over his fish. He did it with a practiced, elegant motion, the same motion he used when signing his name on a contract. I folded my hands back into my lap, my fingers resting against the cold, smooth fabric of my skirt. The dinner would last another 2 hours. There would be dessert, coffee, and more toasts. Then we would drive home in the quiet of his luxury sedan, and he would ask me to make him a cup of chamomile tea while he checked his email for the first reviews. I looked down at the dark circle of water on the tablecloth. It had stopped expanding. It had reached its limit, the fibers of the linen saturated and heavy, unable to hold another drop. The leather of the passenger seat was cold, even through my wool coat. I pulled the seatbelt across my shoulder, listening to the solid, muted click as it latched. Julian started the engine. The dashboard illuminated our faces in a pale, sterile blue, casting long shadows across his cheeks and highlighting the faint lines around his eyes. He was still vibrating with the energy of the dinner. He adjusted his rearview mirror, his fingers lingering on the glass for a second longer than necessary, checking his reflection. "That went exceptionally well, don't you think?" he asked, shifting the car into reverse. The tires crunched softly over the gravel of the restaurant's parking lot. Holloway was practically glowing. He wants me to do a guest lecture for his honors seminar next month. I kept my head turned toward the window, watching the streetlights bleed into long yellow smears against the rain-streaked glass. "Yes," I said. He seemed impressed. "He is," Julian said, his voice carrying that familiar, buoyant confidence. "And the publisher is already pushing for the draft of the next book. Marcus told me tonight that if we can get the manuscript to them by October, they can fast-track the spring release." He used the word "we." It was a slip of the tongue, a habit born of our private late-night sessions in the study. But he corrected himself immediately. "If I can get the manuscript to them," he clarified, his voice dropping slightly as he activated the left turn signal. The rhythmic click-clack of the signal filled the quiet cabin of the car, a steady, metronomic beat. "I need to get started on the outline for Chapter 4 tomorrow. I feel like the protagonist's motivation is still a bit soft in the middle section." I watched his thumb tap against the steering wheel. Tap, tap, tap. He was waiting. He was waiting for me to offer the solution, to suggest the psychological turn that would tighten the narrative arc. I had already mapped out the entire middle section in my leather-bound notebook, which was currently sitting on the bottom shelf of my nightstand, hidden beneath a stack of old literary journals. I remained silent, keeping my hands folded in my lap. The silence stretched between us, growing thicker as we turned onto the highway. Julian cleared his throat, a small, dry sound. He glanced at me quickly, his eyes darting away from the road for half a second before returning to the taillights of the car ahead of us. "You were very quiet tonight, Clara," he said. "I was listening," I replied. He let out a short, soft laugh that lacked any real warmth. "Well, you've always been the observant one. But Holloway's wife was trying to engage you. You could have been a bit more forthcoming about the research. She asked about the historical setting, and you just let the question hang. I calculated the energy required to remind him that Holloway's wife had asked about the architecture of 14th century coastal villas, a topic I had spent 3 weeks researching at the university library while Julian was in Cabo with his college friends. I had written the 40-page research brief that he had skimmed on the flight back. I was tired, I said simply. Julian sighed, a sound of gentle, patronizing disappointment. Right, of course. It's been a long week. The car climbed the winding hill toward our neighborhood, the large, secluded homes, shielded by tall pines and manicured hedges. When we pulled into our driveway, the motion-activated floodlights flared to life, washing the front of our Tudor-style house in a harsh, white glare. Julian turned off the ignition. The sudden absence of the engine's vibration felt heavy, almost physical. He unbuckled his seatbelt, but did not immediately get out. He reached across the console, his hand coming to rest over mine. His palm was warm, slightly damp from the steering wheel. About the dedication, he said, his voice dropping to that intimate register he used when he wanted to smooth over an awkwardness. I know it might have seemed sudden, but Genevieve has been doing an incredible amount of organizational work. The press kits, the scheduling, the correspondence. It really freed up my mental space to focus on the prose. I wanted to show her some professional appreciation. I knew you'd understand. I looked down at his hand covering mine. I could feel the rhythmic pulse in his index finger. Of course, I said. He squeezed my hand once, a quick, relieved pressure, before releasing it. Good. I knew you would. You've always been so grounded about these things. He opened his door, the interior lights of the car clicking on, exposing the empty leather seats, the discarded mint wrappers in the cup holder, and the copy of his book resting on the back seat. I got out of the car, the cool night air hitting my face. The scent of damp pine and wet earth was sharp, a welcome contrast to the heavy, buttery air of the bistro. I walked up the stone steps to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped into the quiet hallway. Our house was always quiet after midnight. The oak floorboards were cold beneath my thin-soled shoes as I walked toward the kitchen. It was a spacious room, all gray marble and brushed steel, designed for a lifestyle we rarely lived. We didn't host large dinners here. We went to restaurants where Julian could be seen. I hung my coat in the hall closet and walked to the kitchen island. Julian went straight up the stairs to his study. I heard the heavy creak of the floorboards directly above my head, followed by the soft click of his desk lamp turning on. I moved through my routine. I took the small ceramic kettle, filled it with filtered water from the tap, and set it on the stove. I reached into the pantry for the tin of loose chamomile tea. Usually, I would measure out 2 tablespoons of the leaves into the silver infuser, place it in his favorite ceramic mug, the one with the faded gold rim, and carry it up the stairs to his study. I would sit on the small leather armchair in the corner of his study, and we would talk for an hour about the next chapter, my voice acting as the filter through which his disorganized thoughts became a structured narrative. Tonight, I measured the tea leaves into the infuser. I watched the water in the kettle begin to simmer, small bubbles rising to the surface and popping silently. When the kettle whistled, a thin, high-pitched reed of sound in the dark kitchen, I poured the hot water over the leaves. The steam rose, carrying the sweet apple-like scent of chamomile into the cold room. But I did not put the mug on a tray. I did not take it upstairs. I placed the mug on the cold marble of the kitchen island, right next to the cutting board. I picked up my own mug of warm water, walked down the hall to the small downstairs guest bedroom, the one I had been using as a sewing room, and closed the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the twin bed, the sheets cold and stiff against my legs. Above me, the floorboards creaked. I heard Julian's footsteps move from the desk to the door of his study. He walked to the top of the stairs. He paused. "Clara!" he called out, his voice muffled by the heavy plaster walls. "Clara, is the tea ready?" I did not answer. I took a slow sip of my water, watching the yellow light from the hallway filter through the crack at the bottom of the guest room door. The silence in the house was absolute, save for the steady, distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The dawn light was gray and thin, creeping through the slats of the wooden blinds in the downstairs bedroom. I lay still on the narrow twin bed, listening to the house settle. A floorboard creaked upstairs, followed by the dull, metallic groan of the pipes as Julian turned on the shower. I sat up and pulled a thick wool cardigan over my shoulders. The air in the guest room was cold, smelling faintly of the lavender sachets I had placed in the linen closet 3 years ago. My routine for the last 6 years had been precise. I would wake at 6, slip quietly out of our shared bed, make a pot of French press coffee, and print out Julian's daily schedule, along with any overnight emails from his agent or publicist. By the time he came downstairs at 7, his breakfast would be on the table, and his workspace would be cleared and ready. Today, I walked into the kitchen at 6:45. The mug of chamomile tea from last night sat exactly where I had left it, on the gray marble island. The water had turned a dark, bruised amber, and a thin, translucent film had formed over the surface. The silver infuser rested at an angle, its chain draped over the rim like a discarded anchor. I did not touch it. Instead, I took a single-serving ceramic dripper from the cupboard, placed a paper filter inside, and measured out exactly 2 tablespoons of coffee grounds. I boiled water in the small copper kettle. The kitchen was quiet, except for the steady, rhythmic drip of the hot water passing through the filter into my single mug. The bitter, dark aroma of the coffee began to fill the room, but it was a solitary scent, confined to my corner of the counter. I toasted a single slice of rye bread. When it popped up, I placed it on a small white plate, added no butter, and sat down at the small wooden table in the breakfast nook facing the garden. Outside, a thick morning fog hung low over the lawn, obscuring the gravel path that led to Julian's writing cottage at the back of the property. The blue hydrangeas I had planted along the fence looked washed out, their heavy heads drooping under the weight of the morning dew. At 7, the sound of Julian's slippers padding down the stairs broke the quiet. He entered the kitchen, his silk robe tied loosely around his waist. He looked freshly shaved, his hair damp and brushed back, though there were dark smudges of fatigue under his eyes. He stopped when he reached the island. His eyes fell on the cold mug of tea. He stared at it for 3 long seconds, his brow furrowing slightly, before he looked over at me sitting by the window. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying the slightly gravelly texture of early morning. "Morning," I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Julian hesitated, his hand hovering near the cold mug. Did you leave this out last night?" he asked, his tone light, almost conversational, as if he were trying to solve a minor, amusing puzzle. "I made it for you," I said. "You asked if it was ready." Julian's hand dropped. "Oh, right. I must have fallen asleep at the desk. I had so many Google alerts coming in about the book launch. And then Marcus called about some early blog reviews. I completely lost track of time." He laughed, a soft, self-deprecating sound. "You should have brought it up. You know how I get when I'm in the zone." I took a bite of my toast. The dry bread crunched loudly in the quiet room. "I didn't want to disturb you," I said. He looked at the empty stove, then at the single-serving coffee dripper resting on the counter. Did you make a pot?" "No," I said, "just a cup." Julian blinked. For a fraction of a second, his polished exterior slipped, revealing a flash of genuine confusion. He was used to the coffee pot being full, the carafe insulated, the cream already sitting in the small ceramic pitcher. "Ah," he said, his voice tightening slightly. "Right. Well, I suppose I can make some. Where do we keep the espresso pods now? Did Genevieve move them when she organized the pantry last week?" "They are in the drawer next to the fridge," I said, without looking up from my plate. Julian moved to the drawer, his movements slightly less graceful than usual. He pulled it open, rummaging through the neat rows of colored aluminum capsules. He picked one up, turned it over, and looked at the espresso machine as if it were a foreign piece of machinery. Usually, I would get up, take the pod from his hand, and prepare his double macchiato while he read the morning paper. I calculated the emotional energy required to watch him struggle with the water reservoir versus the energy required to sit still and finish my toast. I decided to finish my toast. After 2 minutes of fumbling, the machine began to hiss and grind, a loud mechanical shuddering that vibrated through the marble island. Julian leaned against the counter, holding a mug that didn't match. "Did you sleep downstairs last night?" he asked. He kept his eyes on the stream of dark liquid dripping into his cup, his voice carefully neutral, as if he were asking about the weather. "Yes," I said. "Why?" "I didn't want to wake you when I came in," I said. "And the guest room bed is firmer. My back has been aching." Julian didn't look at me. He nodded slowly, his fingers tapping a light, impatient rhythm against the side of his mug. "Right, of course. You should have told me. I could have helped you move the mattress or something." He didn't mean it, and we both knew it. Julian hadn't lifted a piece of furniture in 10 years. He hired students from the university for that. He took a sip of his espresso, winced slightly, he had likely forgotten to add the sugar, and set the cup down. "By the way, Clara, did you get the email from Genevieve this morning? She was supposed to send over the updated schedule for the afternoon radio interviews. I need the talking points for the second chapter. The interviewer is notoriously sharp about the historical accuracy of the subplots. I checked my watch. It was 7:15. I haven't opened my laptop yet, I said. Julian's eyebrows rose slightly. Oh, well, could you? I really need to review those notes before 10. Genevieve said she emailed the file at midnight, but I can't seem to find it on my tablet. She probably put it in the shared drive, but you know how I am with the cloud folders. It's all Greek to me. He smiled, using that helpless, boyish charm that had once seemed endearing. It was the charm of a man who believed his time was too valuable to be spent learning how to navigate a file directory. I set my coffee mug down on the wooden table. The ceramic made a sharp, clean click against the wood. I'll look at it when I finish my breakfast, I said. Julian opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to push, but the absolute lack of urgency in my voice seemed to stop him. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since he had walked into the room. His smile didn't return. He took his mug of espresso, turned, and walked back toward the stairs, his slippers dragging softly against the hardwood floor. I sat in the quiet kitchen, the cold fog pressing against the window pane, and picked up my dry toast. By 9:30, the fog had turned into a steady, persistent drizzle that tapped rhythmically against the glass of the guest room window. I sat at the small walnut desk in the corner, the only piece of furniture in the room that belonged to my grandmother. It was scratched and worn, the finish dulled by years of lemon oil and sunlight. I opened my laptop. The fan whirred to life, a low mechanical purr that was the loudest sound in the small room. I logged into the shared drive that Julian and I had used for the last 4 years. It was labeled simply Vance Manuscripts. Inside were folders for each of his books, organized by draft number, research files, and publicity schedules. I opened the folder for his new novel, the one that had been celebrated only 12 hours prior. I navigated to a subfolder labeled Publicity, then to a document titled Radio Talking Points. The file details showed it had been uploaded at 11:58 the night before. By Genevieve. I opened the document. As I scrolled through the 3 pages, a familiar tightness settled in my neck. Genevieve had tried to compile a list of historical facts about the 14th century coastal villas that served as the setting for the novel's central mystery. But she had worked from the raw, unedited notes I had abandoned on the shared drive months ago. On page 2, she had copied a paragraph about the architectural layout, but she had mislabeled the villa as an example of Gothic revival. Gothic revival was a 19th century movement. The villa in the book was strictly medieval Gothic. It was a glaring, amateurish error. Julian's interviewer this afternoon was Alan Fletcher, a former academic who had spent 20 years writing biting cultural critiques for the national newspapers. Fletcher lived for these kinds of slip-ups. He would dismantle Julian on live radio for suggesting a 14th century Italian merchant lived in a 19th century Victorian fantasy. Historically, this was the moment I would intervene. I would open the document, rewrite the paragraph, verify the dates, and upload the corrected file under the same name, so Julian would never even know he had been on the precipice of public embarrassment. I would do this quietly, without asking for thanks, because protecting Julian's reputation was, by extension, protecting our livelihood. I hovered my cursor over the edit button. I calculated the energy required to fix the error. It would take me 6 minutes. It would save Julian from a highly public humiliation. But it would also reinforce the lie that he was the meticulous researcher he claimed to be. It would allow him to continue taking the credit while Genevieve took the praise for being his invaluable, light-bringing muse. I moved the cursor away from the button. I closed the tab. The sound of a car engine turning over in the driveway broke my focus. I looked out the window. Genevieve's small silver hatchback had pulled up to the curb. She stepped out of the car, holding a bright yellow umbrella over her head and cradling a white paper bag from the artisanal bakery downtown against her chest. She walked quickly up the brick path, her low heels clicking sharply against the wet stone. I heard the front door click open. Genevieve had been given a copy of the key 3 months ago during the final editing rush, so she could drop off proofs without waking Julian if he was napping. "Clara," her voice called out from the foyer, light and tentative. "Hello?" I stood up, walked out of the guest room, and met her in the hallway. Genevieve was shaking her umbrella outside the door before stepping onto the hardwood floor. She smelled of rain and a sweet, lavender-scented hand cream. When she saw me, she gave a small, polite start, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh, good morning, Clara. I didn't expect you to be downstairs. I brought those almond croissants Julian likes from the bakery on 4th Street. I thought he might want something sweet before the interview." "Thank you," I said, keeping my hands in the pockets of my cardigan. "He's upstairs in his study." "Great," she said, her eyes shifting past me to the closed guest room door, then back to my face. She looked slightly uncomfortable, as if she had sensed the subtle shift in the house's temperature, but couldn't locate the source. "Did you happen to look over those talking points I sent last night? I wanted to make sure I got the tone right. Julian was really stressed about the Fletcher interview." "I didn't open the file," I said. Genevieve's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Oh, well, that's fine. I checked the research folders you left on the drive, so I'm sure everything is accurate. I tried to use your exact phrasing from the villa descriptions." She adjusted the strap of her leather tote bag, her eyes lingering on my face, waiting for me to say more, to offer the validation she usually sought from me. When I remained silent, she cleared her throat and shifted her weight. "Well, I'll just take these up to him then," she said, gesturing with the bakery bag. "We have a lot of prep to do before we leave for the station at noon." "Of course," I said, stepping aside to let her pass. She walked past me, her perfume trailing in her wake. As she reached the stairs, she stopped and turned back. "Oh, by the way, Clara, Julian mentioned he might want to do a small dinner with Marcus and the publicist after the radio show. Just a celebratory thing. Would you mind calling the bistro to see if they can squeeze us in around 7? They usually have a table for Julian if we call ahead." I looked at her. Her tone was perfectly polite, the tone of a junior colleague asking a helper for a small favor. She didn't realize she was treating me like a personal assistant. Or perhaps she did. "I have some errands to run this afternoon," I said. "I won't be able to make the call." Genevieve blinked, her hand tightening on the wooden banister. "Oh, okay, no problem. I can try to do it between the sound checks. It's just that they're usually so much nicer when you call." I offered a small, neutral nod. Genevieve turned and began to climb the stairs, her movements slightly stiffer now. I watched her go, listening to the creak of the steps under her feet, until she reached the landing and tapped softly on the door of Julian's study. I walked back into the guest room and shut the door. I sat down at the walnut desk. I opened a drawer and pulled out a small, heavy metal brick, my external hard drive. I plugged the USB cable into the side of my laptop. The drive began to spin, a high-pitched, clean whistle that vibrated through the wood of the desk. I opened the shared drive again. I selected the folder labeled Vance Manuscripts. I began the process of copying every single file, the outlines, the character Bibles, the scene drafts, and the raw research, onto my local drive. When the transfer progress bar appeared on my screen, showing 64 gigabytes of data, I sat back and watched the green line slowly crawl from left to right. The progress bar on my laptop screen blinked once, then disappeared. The silver external drive emitted a soft, final click before settling into a quiet, cold stillness. I clicked the small icon in the system tray to safely eject the drive, waited for the prompt to confirm it was safe, and then pulled the USB cable from the port. The physical routine of packing it away was therapeutic. I wound the black cable into a neat 3-inch circle, securing it with a small wire twist tie. I opened the bottom drawer of the walnut desk, lifted the false velvet lining of an old jewelry box, and slipped the drive underneath. It lay flat, invisible to anyone who might open the drawer looking for a pen or a pad of paper. I closed the drawer, the old wood sliding into place with a dry, satisfying rasp. From the floor above, the quiet of the morning was abruptly shattered. The heavy, hurried stamp of Julian's leather-soled shoes echoed down the stairwell, accompanied by the sharp slide of wooden desk drawers being pulled open and pushed shut with unnecessary force. "Clara!" Julian's voice was loud, vibrating with the sharp, rising panic that always preceded his public appearances. "Clara, where is the brass-clasped journal, the black one?" I did not answer immediately. I walked out of the guest room and stood in the center of the foyer, looking up the elegant, curved staircase. Julian appeared at the top landing. His dark blue interview blazer was on, but his collar was half folded under, and his silk tie hung loose and unknotted around his neck. Behind him, Genevieve stood in the doorway of his study, holding his tablet and a stack of printed papers in her hands. She looked small and anxious, her eyes darting between Julian and the floor. "Clara!" Julian called down again, his hand gripping the white wooden banister. "Did you hear me? The black journal with the brass clasp, the one with the handwritten notes on the courtyard timeline. I need it for the Fletcher interview. He's going to ask about the structural layout of the villa's eastern wing." I know exactly where that journal was. It was sitting on the bottom shelf of my nightstand in the guest room, tucked beneath 3 old issues of a literary quarterly. It contained 80 pages of my handwritten prose, the exact architectural descriptions, and the calculated timelines that made the novel's climax structurally plausible. I calculated the energy required to bring it to him, to watch him present my handwriting as his own inspiration on a national radio broadcast. I calculated the alternative, the minor friction of his discomfort. "I haven't seen it since last week," I said, my voice flat, carrying easily up the high ceiling of the foyer. Julian's face tightened. "What do you mean you haven't seen it? You had it on Tuesday when we were reviewing the galley proofs. You always keep track of the physical journals." "I don't remember where it was placed," I said. "Perhaps it is in your leather satchel, or perhaps Genevieve packed it with the promotional materials." Julian turned his head sharply to look at Genevieve. Genevieve's cheeks went pale. She shook her head quickly, her glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of her nose. "No, Julian," she said, her voice high and defensive. "I only packed the printed digital files from the shared drive. You told me you had the physical journals in your desk." "I don't have them in my desk," Julian snapped, his usual polished charm completely absent. "I've looked through every drawer. This is exactly why I need things kept in their proper places." He looked back down the stairs at me. His eyes were wide, a strange, desperate look in them. It was the look of a man who suddenly realized he was missing his script. "Clara, please," he said, his tone softening into a pleading, manipulative warmth. "Just think for a second. It has the original character sketches for the merchant's daughter. If Fletcher asks about her lineage and I don't have the dates, I'll look like an amateur. Can't you just do a quick search of the living room?" I stood perfectly still. I looked at the unknotted tie hanging around his neck. "I've already looked," I lied. "It isn't downstairs." Julian let out a sharp, frustrated breath. He checked his watch. It was 11:40. "We have to go," Genevieve whispered from behind him, her voice trembling slightly. "The traffic on the bridge is already backing up because of the rain. If we're late, Marcus said the station won't hold the slot." Julian slammed his hand onto the banister. "Damn it," he muttered. He reached up and clumsily pulled his tie straight, his fingers fumbling with the silk knot. Usually I would step forward, brush his hands away, and tie it for him with a neat double Windsor knot, checking his lapels for stray lint before sending him out the door. Instead, I walked to the front closet, pulled out my own umbrella, and slipped my feet into my rain boots. "Are you coming with us?" Julian asked, his voice sounding hollow as he began to descend the stairs, Genevieve hovering a step behind him like a nervous shadow. "No," I said, opening the heavy oak front door. "I told you I have errands to run." Julian stopped on the third step from the bottom. He looked at me, his eyes scanning my face, searching for the familiar softness, the automatic compliance he had relied on for nearly a decade. He found none. The silence between us was like a pane of thick glass. "Right," he said slowly. "Well, I suppose we'll see you this evening. Wish me luck." "Good luck," I said. He stepped past me into the cold, damp air of the porch. Genevieve followed, her eyes fixed on the floorboards as she muttered a small, nervous goodbye. I watched them walk down the brick steps under the yellow umbrella. Julian's shoulders were tense, his head ducked against the rain. He looked smaller than he did on his book jackets. They got into the silver hatchback. The engine started with a wet, heavy rumble, and the car backed slowly out of the driveway, its red taillights bleeding into the gray mist of the street. I closed the heavy front door. The lock turned with a solid, definitive click. The house was suddenly beautifully quiet. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic dripping of the rain from the gutters onto the flagstone patio. I walked back into the kitchen, picked up my empty coffee mug, and placed it in the sink. I did not wash it. I walked back to the guest room, opened the bottom drawer of the walnut desk, and took out my key ring. It was time to go to the bank. The air inside the bank vault was always 5 degrees cooler than the lobby, carrying a faint metallic scent of copper and industrial grease. I followed the clerk, a quiet woman with a silver name tag that read Susan, down the short carpeted hallway to the heavy iron gate. She selected her key from a large brass ring, turned it in the lock with a heavy, satisfying clank, and ushered me into the room of safety deposit boxes. Row upon row of small, brushed steel doors lined the walls, each with 2 keyholes. Susan stood to the side, waiting for me to point out my box. Number 412, located near the bottom, just above the floor. I knelt on the low-pile blue carpet, my knees sinking into the stiff fibers. I inserted my key. Susan inserted hers. Together, we turned them in unison, the internal tumblers falling into place with a double metallic click that echoed in the small, concrete-reinforced chamber. She pulled the long, narrow tin box from the slot, placed it in my hands, and pointed toward the small, private viewing room in the corner. "I'll leave you to your privacy, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice dropping to a respectful, hushed whisper. "Thank you, Susan," I said. I walked into the small booth and closed the heavy oak door. The room was barely large enough for the mahogany table and the single leather chair it contained. Above me, a single fluorescent tube hummed a low, erratic note, flickering slightly every few seconds. I sat down and set the metal tin on the table. From my large leather tote bag, I pulled out the black, brass-clasped journal that Julian had been frantically screaming for only 2 hours earlier. I laid it on the polished wood. The cover was slightly scuffed, the leather smelling of dust and ink. I stroked the brass clasp, my thumb tracing the small scratches on the metal. This book contained 18 months of my labor. It held the original character arcs, the hand-drawn maps of the Italian coast, and the meticulous timelines that Julian could never quite keep straight in his head. I also pulled out the silver external hard drive, its black cable still coiled and tied with the wire twist. I opened the metal safety deposit box. Inside were only a few items: my grandmother's simple pearl necklace, my individual savings account passbook from before my marriage, and my passport. I placed the black journal on the bottom of the box. I set the silver hard drive on top of it. As I reached into my bag to place the USB cable inside, my phone began to vibrate against the mahogany table. The hard plastic of the phone case rattled loudly against the polished wood, the sound amplified by the quiet, enclosed space of the booth. I looked at the screen. It was Julian. I did not pick up. I watched the screen glow, his name flashing in white letters against the dark background. The call rang out, silent in my hand, and then the screen went black. A second later, the phone vibrated again. This time, it was a text message from Genevieve. "Clara, please call Julian," the message read. "We are at the station. Fletcher's producer just brought in a book about medieval Italian architecture, and Julian is having a panic attack. He says there's a contradiction in the talking points about the villa's eastern wing. Is it 14th century Gothic or Gothic revival? Julian is shouting at me, and I don't know what to tell him. We go on in 12 minutes. Please. I looked at the text. I calculated the exact distance between where I sat and where they stood. They were 5 miles away in a soundproof studio surrounded by producers and microphones. If I replied, if I corrected the error, Julian would walk onto the air with his mask intact. He would deliver the line I gave him, and the audience would marvel at his brilliant historical grasp. If I did not reply, he would have to rely on his own memory or on Genevieve's hasty internet searches. I also calculated the energy it had taken me to keep that mask in place for 7 years. Every television appearance, every radio interview, every book festival panel had required weeks of my quiet background preparation, drilling him on names, dates, and architectural terms until he could recite them like a native scholar. I placed the phone flat on the mahogany table, face down. I reached into my bag, pulled out the USB cable, and set it neatly beside the hard drive in the metal tin. I closed the heavy lid of the safety deposit box, the metal on metal sliding together with a soft, final sigh. My phone vibrated twice more against the wood. 2 missed calls, one from Julian, one from an unknown number that I assumed was the radio station's front desk. I picked up the phone. I slid the power button on the side and held it down until the screen faded to black. The vibration stopped. The silence in the booth returned, absolute and heavy. I picked up the metal tin, walked out of the booth, and signaled to Susan. She met me at the vault gate, her keys jingling softly. Together, we slid the tin back into slot 412, inserted our keys, and locked it away. "Thank you, Susan," I said again, my voice calm, almost light. "Have a wonderful afternoon, Mrs. Vance," she replied, offering a polite, practiced smile. I walked out of the bank's heavy glass doors into the cool, gray afternoon. The rain had softened into a fine mist that clung to my eyelashes and damp hair. I walked down the block to my car, got into the driver's seat, and closed the door. The interior of the car was quiet, smelling faintly of the leather and the lavender sachet I kept in the glove compartment. I turned the key in the ignition. The dashboard lit up, but I did not turn on the engine. Instead, I pressed the power button on the radio. I tuned the dial to 93.5, the local public broadcasting station. A soft classical piano piece was ending. Then the familiar, dry voice of the station announcer broke through the static. And now we return to Afternoon Arts with Alan Fletcher. Today we are joined by best-selling novelist Julian Vance, whose new book, The Whispering Tide, has just arrived in bookstores this morning. I leaned my head back against the leather headrest, closed my eyes, and listened to the rain tap against the windshield. The wiper blades made a dry, rhythmic squeak as they dragged across the glass, clearing the mist before the rain immediately reclaimed it. I did not turn the car engine on, preferring the cool, still dampness of the cabin. The only sound was the low, steady fan of the radio receiver and the sharp, intellectual voice of Alan Fletcher filling the small space. "Your prose has been praised for its cinematic detail, Julian," Fletcher was saying, his tone smooth but carrying a distinct razor-sharp edge. "The coastal setting of The Whispering Tide feels almost like a character in itself." "Thank you, Alan," Julian's voice responded. The broadcast compressed his baritone, but he still sounded polished, using the slow, deliberate cadence he always adopted for the public. It was a voice designed to sound like old leather and wood smoke. I spent many months visualizing that coast. I wanted the reader to feel the salt in the air, the coldness of the stone. "Yes, the stone," Fletcher said. "Let's talk about the stone." In Chapter 2, you describe the main setting, the Villa d'Este, as an exquisite 14th century Gothic revival structure. You make several references to the ribbed vaulting and the pointed arches as authentic examples of the early revival style of 1380. Fletcher paused. On a radio broadcast, a pause of even 2 seconds feels like an eternity. "Now, Julian," Fletcher continued, his voice dripping with polite curiosity, "as I'm sure your academic readers have already noted, the Gothic revival movement did not begin until the mid-18th century in England. A 14th century Italian merchant building a Gothic revival villa would be a bit like Julius Caesar checking his pocket watch. Did you intend this as some sort of magical realism, or is there a historical anomaly I've missed?" I reached out and adjusted the volume knob on the dashboard. I turned it 2 notches to the right, the plastic clicking beneath my thumb. The silence that followed was absolute. On live public radio, 5 miles away, Julian was drowning. I knew exactly what his face looked like in that studio. His eyes would be wide, his throat dry, his hand probably reaching for the water glass that Genevieve was supposed to have filled for him. "Well, Alan," Julian finally said. He let out a light, hollow laugh that sounded incredibly thin over the airwaves. "You have a very sharp eye, as always." The term was used somewhat poetically in the text. I was referring more to the spiritual revival of the Gothic sentiment within the family itself, rather than a strict architectural taxonomy. "But the text describes the masonry, Julian," Fletcher pressed, his tone entirely devoid of mercy. "You write that the mortar was mixed using the specific formulas of the early 19th century revivalists. You even mention the architect's name as an ancestor of the protagonist. It seems rather specific for a spiritual metaphor." Another pause. I could hear the faint, dry rustle of papers over the microphone. That would be Julian, frantically shuffling through the 3 pages of unedited notes Genevieve had printed for him. "Well," Julian said, his voice rising a fraction of an octave, losing its smooth wood smoke texture. "To be perfectly candid, Alan, when you are working on a historical project of this scale, the administrative load can be immense. I rely on a small, dedicated research team to compile the structural and architectural background. My research assistant, Genevieve, handled the archival folders for the regional architecture. It appears there may have been a transcription error in the brief she prepared for the final galleys." He was throwing her to the wolves. On live regional radio, before an audience of his peers, colleagues, and readers, Julian had just shifted the blame to a 24-year-old assistant to save himself from looking foolish. I leaned my head back against the headrest, watching a single fat raindrop slide down the side window, trailing a crooked path through the grime of the glass. I calculated his panic. I knew Julian's psychological limits precisely. When threatened, he did not fight. He looked for a shield. For 7 years, I had been that shield. I had vetted every brief, corrected every date, and quietly smoothed over every minor contradiction before he ever sat in front of a microphone. He had grown so accustomed to the absolute security of my protection that he had forgotten how to look before he leaped. "I see," Fletcher said on the radio, his voice flat, making no effort to hide his skepticism. "So it was an administrative error. Well, perhaps your assistant should spend a bit more time in the university archives before the next volume. Let us move on to the character of the merchant's daughter. Her lineage is described as—" Fletcher moved the conversation along, but the damage was done. The polished veneer of Julian Vance, the meticulous, brilliant literary historian, had cracked. The word assistant had been uttered. The illusion of the solitary genius working in his quiet cottage had been punctured on live air, and the blame had been public, clumsy, and small-minded. I reached out and clicked the power button on the radio. The silence that rushed back into the car was deafening. The squeak of the wiper blades had stopped when I turned the key to the accessory position, leaving only the soft, irregular tap of the rain on the steel roof above me. Julian would be furious when he left that studio. He would not be angry at himself, of course. He would be angry at Genevieve for preparing the bad notes. He would be angry at Fletcher for being pedantic. And eventually, when the adrenaline faded and he returned to the quiet of the house, he would be angry at me. He would be angry at me because I had not been there to catch him. I started the car engine. The motor hummed to life, the heater fan blowing a warm, dry draft of air across my ankles. I shifted the car into drive, turned the steering wheel, and pulled out into the wet gray street, leaving the bank behind me. I had one more stop to make before the afternoon ended. The office of Croft and Associates sat on the third floor of an old brick building near the courthouse, where the windows overlooked the dripping canopy of 3 massive maple trees. Inside, the noise of the city street was reduced to a soft, watery hiss. The room smelled of tea, old wool, and the dry, sweet scent of decaying paper from the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that lined the walls. Arthur Croft sat behind his heavy mahogany desk, his silver hair neatly parted. He wore a dark tweed vest over his shirt, his reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead. Between us lay a thin, beige manila folder containing the photocopies of Julian's multi-book contract with his publisher, Marcus & Sterling. I reached out and adjusted the brass desk lamp, tilting the shades slightly so the warm light fell directly onto the 3rd page of the document. My physical routine in these moments was always deliberate. I used a thin, dry yellow pencil to trace the lines of text, my fingers holding the wood lightly, the lead whispering softly against the paper. I read the indemnity clause for the 4th time. "In the event of a material breach," Arthur murmured, his voice low and steady, matching the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Specifically, a failure to deliver the completed manuscript of the 2nd option book, currently titled The Glass Mirror, by the specified deadline of October 15th. The publisher retains the right to demand full repayment of the signing advance. "And that advance has already been paid?" I asked. "Yes," Arthur said, tapping a finger on a line of financial figures. $150,000, paid in 2 installments. the first $75,000 upon signing, and the second $75,000 upon their acceptance of the detailed chapter outline last month. The chapter outline that I had written, edited, and formatted while Julian was suffering from a week-long migraine. And the joint account, I asked, keeping my pencil poised over the word liability. Arthur shifted his glasses down onto his nose, peering over the frames at me. The joint account is, by definition, joint. If the publisher initiates a clawback, those funds are vulnerable. However, the property on Pinecrest Road, the house, is entirely secure. Your grandmother's trust purchased the land, and the deed remains solely in your maiden name. Julian has no equity in the structure itself, provided he has not made substantial financial contributions to its upkeep or mortgage. He has not, I said. All major repairs and property taxes have been paid from the trust disbursement account. I have kept the receipts in the safe deposit box. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, the old springs groaning softly. He picked up his mug of tea, taking a slow, contemplative sip. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes quiet and analytical. He had known my father. He had represented my family's estate since before I was born. He was not a man who asked loud questions, but he was a man who noticed when the ledger began to tilt. "Clara," he said, setting the mug down with a soft click on the wooden desk. "Is Julian struggling with the work?" "He is exploring other avenues of inspiration," I said, my voice remaining perfectly even. Arthur nodded slowly. "I see. And you are preparing for the possibility that those avenues might not lead to a manuscript by October?" "I am simply organizing my affairs, Arthur. I like to keep the ledger balanced." He did not push further. A good lawyer knows when to stop asking and start drafting. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a clean white sheet of paper. "If you want to protect your personal assets from any potential publishing liabilities, we should formally partition the joint account," he said, his pen hovering over the page. "I can draft an agreement that separates your personal savings and the trust disbursements into an independent entity, entirely isolated from Julian's literary earnings. It will require his signature, of course." I calculated the timing. If I presented him with a partition agreement now, while he was still riding the wave of the book launch, he would be defensive, angry, and suspicious. But if I waited until the friction of his failure began to mount, when he realized he could not write a single page of the new book without me, he would sign anything to keep me from walking out the door before the deadline. "We will hold on the partition for now," I said, sliding the yellow pencil back into my purse. "Just prepare the documents so they are ready. I want the structures in place." "Of course," Arthur said. He stood up, offering his hand across the desk. His palm was dry and warm. "Take care of yourself, Clara. It's a heavy load you've been carrying." "Thank you, Arthur," I said. I walked out of the office and down the quiet, carpeted stairs to the ground floor lobby. The glass doors of the building showed the street outside, where the rain was now falling in fat, heavy drops, bouncing off the black hoods of parked cars. I sat on the wooden bench in the lobby, reached into my bag, and turned my phone back on. The screen lit up almost immediately, a cascade of notifications vibrating against my palm like a trapped insect. 3 missed calls from Julian, 2 missed calls from Genevieve, 1 missed call from Marcus, Julian's literary agent, and then A voicemail notification from Marcus. I pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the static-laced recording. "Clara?" Marcus's voice was loud, his breath heavy, his usual theatrical enthusiasm replaced by a sharp, professional strain. "Clara, if you're there, please pick up. I've just listened to the Fletcher interview. What the hell happened out there? Julian is in a complete state. He's locked himself in the green room at the station and is refusing to come out for the evening signing. Genevieve is in tears on the phone with my assistant. We need you to come down here and straighten this out. Julian says there's a problem with the research files. Call me back as soon as you get this." I hung up. I looked at the glass doors, watching the rain wash over the street. The silence of the lobby was thick, broken only by the hum of the vending machine in the corner. I stood up, opened my umbrella, and stepped out into the storm. The tires of my sedan rolled quietly over the wet gravel of the driveway, the sound muffled by the thick, steady downpour. I turned off the ignition and sat in the darkness of the car for a moment, listening to the heavy drum of rain on the metal roof. The house stood before me, dark and silent, its windows reflecting the gray, metallic light of the late afternoon. I opened my door, stepping out into the cool air, and walked up the stone steps. Inside, the hallway was cold. I hung my wet coat on a wooden hanger in the closet, watching the small droplets of water slide down the dark wool and fall onto the copper drip pan below. I slipped off my leather boots and placed them neatly side by side on the rubber mat. My movements were slow, deliberate, a quiet ritual to reestablish my presence in the space. I took a small cotton cloth from the drawer, knelt on the floor, and wiped the few wet footprints I had tracked onto the oak floorboards. I rinsed the cloth in the kitchen sink, folded it into a precise square, and hung it over the metal rack to dry. The kitchen was exactly as I had left it. The cold mug of chamomile tea still sat on the marble island, its dark surface reflecting the single overhead light I had switched on. I picked up the mug, emptied its contents down the drain, and rinsed the ceramic under the hot water tap until the dark stains vanished. I made a simple bowl of broth, heating it slowly on the stove. The quiet hiss of the gas burner and the gentle, savory steam rising from the pot were the only signs of life in the massive house. I carried the bowl to the small wooden table in the breakfast nook, pulled out a chair, and sat down. I pulled my phone from the pocket of my cardigan and laid it on the table next to my spoon. The screen lit up with Julian's messages. I scrolled through them slowly, my eyes skimming the frantic, defensive prose. 4:32 p.m. "Clara, why is your phone off? This is urgent." Holloway was listening. 4:45 p.m. "Marcus is trying to reach you. Fletcher was incredibly hostile. He completely misrepresented the text. I need the original research folders for the Italian coastal villas uploaded to the shared drive immediately. Genevieve says they aren't in the publicity folder." 5:02 p.m. "Genevieve is completely overwhelmed. She prepared the wrong brief. I need you to look at the timeline again. Where are you? Why aren't you answering?" 5:30 p.m. "We had to cancel the evening signing at the university bookstore. I am in no state to do public readings after that ambush. We are heading back now. Have the study cleared and make sure the master draft is open on the desktop. We have the local morning television spot at 8 a.m. I set the phone down. I picked up my spoon and took a sip of the warm broth. The heat spread slowly through my chest. Julian was 51 years old. He had a master's degree in literature, a highly paid speaking agent, and 4 published books under his name. Yet, when faced with a simple question about a historical term, his immediate instinct was to flee, lock himself in a green room, cancel an event with his readers, and demand that his wife reconstruct his reality before the next morning. I calculated the distance between his panic and my peace. If I opened the laptop, logged into the shared drive, and reconstructed the files from my local backup, I would be awake until 3 a.m. Julian would sleep, comforted by the knowledge that the television segment would go smoothly. He would walk onto the set tomorrow morning, clean-shaven and smiling, and tell the interviewer how his deep love for Italian history had inspired the villa's design. And I would still be the ghost in the guest room, carrying his weight while he dedicated his success to his muse. I picked up the phone. I tapped on his name and typed a single sentence. I am home. The files on the shared drive are the only copies I have accessible. I sent the message. There was no apology for the dead phone. There was no offer to search the study. There was no promise to have the master draft open on the desktop. Within 10 seconds, the 3 small gray dots appeared on the screen, dancing erratically as Julian began to type his reply. Then they disappeared. Then they appeared again. He was struggling to find the right tone, the perfect balance of professional authority and domestic demand. Finally, a single line appeared. We are 5 minutes away. I set the phone face down on the table. I picked up my bowl, walked to the sink, and washed it with a slow, rhythmic motion of the sponge. I dried it with a clean dish towel, placed it back in the cupboard, and wiped down the counter until the gray marble was smooth and spotless. From the front of the house, the sound of car tires crunching over the wet gravel broke the quiet. The bright yellow beams of headlights swept across the kitchen windows, casting long, skeletal shadows of the bare maple branches across the white cabinets. The engine of Genevieve's silver hatchback died with a final wet cough. The car doors opened and closed with 2 heavy, distinct thuds. I walked out of the kitchen, stood in the center of the dark living room, and watched the front door. The brass handle began to turn. The front door swung open, letting in a sudden, violent swirl of cold wind and rain that made the delicate glass wind chimes on the porch clatter aggressively. Julian stepped into the foyer, his movements sharp and erratic. He slammed the heavy oak door behind him, the force of the impact rattling the brass fixtures. He did not hang up his coat. He simply unbuttoned it with trembling fingers, letting the wet wool drape open. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his keys, and threw them onto the mahogany console table. The metallic crash was loud, vibrating through the quiet hallway. Genevieve followed a step behind him. She was soaked, her thin, sage-green silk dress clinging to her shoulders, her hair plastered to her cheeks in dark, wet tendrils. Her mascara had smudged slightly beneath her eyes, giving her a hollow, ghostly appearance. She cradled her wet leather portfolio against her chest like a shield. I stood near the edge of the living room, my hands tucked into the pockets of my cardigan, watching them. "Clara," Julian said, his voice carrying a dangerous, vibrating quietness. He walked toward me, his leather shoes squeaking loudly on the hardwood floor. "Your phone was off." "I went to the bank," I said, my voice flat and even. "The bank?" Julian's voice cracked slightly, losing its polished, resonant tone. "I was being dismantled on live regional radio by Alan Fletcher. I was sitting in a soundproof booth, drowning, while Halloway and half the department were listening. I called you 5 times. Genevieve called you. Marcus called you." Genevieve stepped forward, her voice shivering and small. "Clara, I swear I didn't do it on purpose. I downloaded the notes from the shared research folder under Chapter 2. I didn't know the dates were wrong. I thought you had already verified those files." She looked at me with wide, frightened eyes, her chin trembling. She was terrified of Julian's anger, which had likely been boiling in the small car for the entire 5-mile drive home. She was looking to me to defend her, or at least to share the blame. Julian didn't let her finish. He waved his hand dismissively, a sharp, impatient gesture that cut through her words. "It doesn't matter what you thought, Genevieve. It was a humiliating mistake." "But Clara, you always review the publicity briefs. You knew Fletcher's reputation. Why on earth didn't you double-check the files before we left?" There it was, the absolute, unshakable core of his entitlement. He had spent the morning celebrating his genius, dedicating his book to his muse, and taking credit for 18 months of my labor. But the moment a mistake was made, a mistake by his hand-picked assistant, using the raw notes I had warned him were incomplete, it was my responsibility to have corrected it. I calculated the energy required to explain the concept of professional boundaries to a man who had never had to observe them. I calculated the effort to argue, to point out that Genevieve was the one receiving the paycheck, the praise, and the dedication page. I chose to let the silence hang between us for 4 long seconds. "Genevieve is your research assistant, Julian," I said, my voice remaining entirely calm. "She is paid to manage your schedules and verify your files. I am not on your publisher's payroll, nor am I your editor. If there was a mistake in her preparation, that is a matter between the 2 of you." Julian stared at me, his mouth opened slightly, his brow furrowing as if I had spoken in a foreign language. For 7 years, my role had been absolute. I was the silent partner, the invisible safety net, the one who smoothed over his rough edges and let him pretend he was the sole architect of his success. He had never heard me speak with this kind of cold, clinical detachment. "What is that supposed to mean?" he muttered, his chest rising and falling beneath his wet shirt. "We are a team, Clara. This book is our livelihood. If my reputation is damaged, it affects both of us." "My maiden name is not on the book cover," I said, "and the house is in my name. My assets are secure." Genevieve let out a tiny, sharp gasp. She looked between the 2 of us, her eyes darting from my calm posture to Julian's reddening face. She was starting to realize, perhaps for the first time, that the dynamic in this house was not what Julian had described to her during their long, quiet editing sessions in his study. She was starting to see the cracks in the foundation. Julian's eyes narrowed. "Is this about the dedication?" he asked, his voice dropping to a harsh, quiet hiss. "Because if it is, Clara, that is incredibly petty. Genevieve has worked her fingers to the bone, organizing my life for 6 months. She deserved that recognition. I didn't think you were the kind of woman who would let professional jealousy ruin a major career milestone." I looked at him. I looked at the wet wool of his coat, the clumsy knot of his tie, the slight tremor in his hands. I felt a profound, empty stillness. "It is not about the dedication," I said. "Then what is it?" he demanded, stepping closer, his boots squeaking again. "We have the local morning television segment at 8 a.m. The producer wants me to talk about the coastal layout of the villa. I need the original black journal, the one with the brass clasp. I know you have it, Clara. Where did you put it?" "I told you this morning, Julian," I said, turning slowly to walk back toward the kitchen. "I don't have it." "Clara!" he shouted after me, his voice echoing off the high plaster walls of the living room. "Clara, stop!" I did not stop. I walked into the kitchen, closed the door behind me, and turned the lock. The heavy brass bolt slid into place with a solid, definitive click. Behind the door, I heard Julian's heavy footsteps approach, followed by the frantic, muffled sound of Genevieve whispering to him, trying to calm him down. I stood in the quiet kitchen, looking at the smooth, empty gray marble of the island. The second stage of the shift was complete. They were no longer merely annoyed. They were confused, fractured, and beginning to realize that the silent resource they had taken for granted had completely run dry. The kitchen clock struck 11. The chime was a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a sound I had grown so accustomed to over the years that I usually didn't hear it at all. Tonight, in the heavy silence of the downstairs, each strike sounded like a small, metallic warning. I sat at the wooden table in the breakfast nook. Before me lay the velvet-lined mahogany chest that held my grandmother's sterling silver flatware. One by one, I pulled the spoons from their fitted slots, checking the tarnish along the delicate floral engraving on the handles. I took a soft flannel cloth, dipped it into a small jar of silver polish, and began to rub the metal in slow, circular motions. This was a physical routine I had neglected for months. The black tarnish came away in greasy, dark smudges on the white flannel, revealing the bright, mirror-like surface of the silver beneath. I calculated the friction of my thumb against the metal, the steady pressure required to restore the shine without scratching the antique engraving. It was a simple, predictable equation of effort and result. Unlike my marriage, the silver did not demand a story to justify its restoration. It simply responded to the work. From the floor above, the muffled sound of Julian's voice drifted down through the heating vents. He was pacing. I could trace his path across the hardwood of his study. 5 steps to the window, a long pause, then 5 steps back to his desk. Every few minutes there would be the sharp, erratic clatter of key strikes, followed by another heavy silence. A floorboard creaked near the top of the stairs, followed by the soft, hesitant pad of footsteps descending into the dark foyer. I did not look up from my polishing. The kitchen door pushed open with a quiet creak. Genevieve stood in the doorway. She had changed out of her damp silk dress and was now wearing a thick, oversized gray university sweatshirt that swallowed her small frame. It was one of Julian's old academic sweaters, the sleeves rolled up twice at her wrists to keep them from covering her hands. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, leaving her looking extraordinarily young, pale, and exhausted. "Oh, Clara," she said, her voice dropping to a startled whisper as she saw me sitting in the corner light. "I didn't think anyone was still awake." "I am just finishing this," I said, sliding the flannel cloth along the bowl of a heavy soup spoon. She stepped further into the kitchen, her bare feet making no sound on the cool tile. She moved toward the espresso machine, her movements stiff and unsure. She picked up the small metal pitcher, looked inside, and then set it back down with a tiny, frustrated sigh. "I was trying to make some coffee for Julian," she murmured, her back to me. He has been trying to rewrite the talking points for the morning show, but he keeps getting stuck on the lineage details for the second chapter. He's very tense." I didn't offer to help. I didn't tell her where the coffee beans were or how to clean the steam wand so the milk wouldn't scorch. I simply picked up another spoon. Genevieve turned around, leaning her lower back against the marble island. She crossed her arms, burying her hands inside the wide sleeves of the gray sweatshirt. She watched me polish the silver, her eyes wide and dark, with a fatigue that went deeper than a lack of sleep. "Clara," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "he is really angry at me. He says I should have known. He says any competent assistant would have cross-referenced the 19th century Gothic revival dates before letting him read them on the air." She had corrected herself, but the slip was telling. She had been about to say, "before letting him make a fool of himself." I kept my eyes on the spoon. "It is difficult to manage a historical novel," I said. "There are many details to keep in order." "Yes," she said quickly, eager for the small scrap of sympathy. "Exactly. And I only copied the files that were in the shared folder. I didn't know they were just the raw notes. Julian told me everything in that folder was ready for the publicity campaign." "Julian believes what is convenient for him to believe," I said. Genevieve let out a small, sharp breath. She looked down at her bare feet, her toes curling slightly against the cold tile floor. I asked him if we could just call you upstairs to help us find the master file, the one with the complete timeline. But he got even angrier. He said I was being incompetent and that he shouldn't have to beg his own wife to find his research." She paused, waiting for me to respond, to offer some explanation for the sudden icy wall she had run into. When I remained silent, she took a slow step closer to the breakfast nook. "Clara," she whispered, her eyes pleading, "he said you have a backup of the original manuscript on an external hard drive, the one you were using for the final proofs last month. Where is it? If I can just copy the specific chapter files for the morning show, I can fix the talking points for him. It would only take 10 minutes. He would be so much calmer tomorrow." I set the polished spoon down on the table. The silver clicked softly against the wood. I looked at her. I looked at the gray sweatshirt that belonged to my husband, the rolled-up sleeves, the desperation in her young face. She was 24. She had entered this house believing she was the inspiration for a literary masterpiece, the brilliant assistant to a charismatic genius. In 6 short months, she had been reduced to a late-night servant, fumbling in a dark kitchen, begging for a file to keep a middle-aged man from screaming at her. "The drive is locked in a secure facility," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "It is not in this house." Genevieve blinked, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "A secure facility? Why? It is just a manuscript. It is Julian's book. It is my intellectual property," I said. She stared at me. The word intellectual property seemed to hang in the damp air between us, heavy and cold. She opened her mouth to speak, to argue, but the sheer, absolute certainty in my tone seemed to stop the words in her throat. She was beginning to realize that the stories Julian had told her about his writing process, the stories of his solitary genius and my simple clerical help, were not just exaggerations, they were completely hollow. Upstairs, the heavy door of Julian's study opened with a sharp, echoing thud. "Genevieve?" His voice boomed down the dark stairwell, tight and impatient. "Genevieve, is that coffee ready yet? I can't find the lineage notes for the 3rd chapter. The file is corrupted." Genevieve flinched, her shoulders tightening as if she had been struck. She looked toward the door, then back at me, her face pale with a sudden, sharp realization of what her morning was going to look like if she went back upstairs empty-handed. I picked up another tarnished spoon, dipped the flannel cloth into the white paste, and began to rub. "Go on up, Genevieve," I said softly, without looking at her. "He doesn't like to be kept waiting." She stood there for a long second, her chest rising and falling in shallow, nervous breaths. Then, without a word, she turned and slipped out of the kitchen, her bare feet pad picker quickly up the stairs toward the light. I sat in the quiet downstairs, the smell of silver polish and old lavender surrounding me, and continued my work. The rain had not stopped by 7 in the morning. It had settled into a dull gray drizzle that cast a cold, uniform light across the kitchen counter. On the small television screen in the corner of the counter, the local morning news anchor was smiling beneath a heavy layer of studio makeup, her voice bright and artificially energetic as she read the morning traffic report. I sat at the counter, a cutting board before me. I picked up a crisp, cold gala apple. Using a small paring knife with a curved blade, I began to peel the skin. This was a physical routine I had practiced since childhood. I pressed the thumb of my right hand against the apple, guiding the steel edge of the knife just below the red skin, carving a single, unbroken spiral. I worked slowly, keeping the width of the peel perfectly uniform, the knife making a faint, wet whispering sound against the fruit. My focus was entirely on the tension of the blade and the resistance of the flesh. It was a micro-moment of complete control. From the hallway, the sound of a zipper sliding shut with a violent yank broke the quiet. Julian came down the stairs, his leather shoes clicking rapidly against the steps. He was fully dressed in his charcoal media suit, but his collar was slightly crumpled on the right side, and his tie, a dark blue silk, was knotted slightly too high, leaving the thin end hanging longer than the thick one. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with red, though he had tried to cover the fatigue with a pat of cooling eye gel. Behind him, Genevieve crept like a shadow. She carried his leather portfolio in one hand and 3 different charging cables in the other. Her hair was pulled into a tight, severe bun, and she looked as though she had spent the entire night crying or reading. She did not look at me. She went straight to the hall closet to retrieve his long wool overcoat. Julian stepped into the kitchen. He did not look at the apple in my hands. He looked at the clock above the stove. "The car is outside," he said, his voice raspy and thin from a night of pacing and arguing. "The driver from the station has been idling in the driveway for 10 minutes. I did not stop peeling. The red spiral ribbon grew longer, draping over my wrist. "We have had to restructure the entire talking points for the second segment," Julian continued, his tone stiff with a defensive, formal coldness. "Genevieve and I stayed up until 4. I've had to rely on my own memory of the trade route chapters because the master files were unavailable." He paused, his eyes drilling into the side of my head, waiting for me to apologize or to say that the files were actually in some hidden folder he had missed. He was offering me a bridge, a way to return to my role as his savior. I kept my eyes on the knife. The blade turned slowly, the pale white flesh of the apple shining under the kitchen light. "I hope the segment goes well," I said. Julian's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, his hand coming down onto the marble counter with a soft, heavy palm strike. "Clara, this is the local affiliate. The broadcast is syndicated across 3 states. Marcus says the sales figures for the first week depend heavily on these morning spots." "I know," I said. "I want you to watch it," he said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register. "Turn the television in the living room to Channel 4 at 8 o'clock. I want a full breakdown of how the interviewer handles the transition to the historical subplots. And let me know if the studio lighting is too harsh on my left side. You know how the camera angles can distort the profile." He was still treating me as his editor, his director, his silent coordinator. He assumed that even if I was angry, my dedication to the brand we had built would compel me to sit on the sofa and take notes on his performance. I calculated the time. It was 7:40. "I have to go to the post office at 8, I said, the knife completing its final turn. The red peel fell away in a single, perfect coil onto the cutting board. "The post office," Julian scoffed, his face twisting in genuine, uncomprehending irritation. "Clara, my segment is at 8. Surely whatever you are mailing can wait until 9. "It is registered mail," I said, setting the knife down. "It is time sensitive." Julian stared at me, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He looked as though he wanted to scream, to sweep the cutting board and the apple onto the floor. But the sudden double honk of the town car's horn from the driveway punctured his anger. Genevieve appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding his coat open. "Julian," she whispered, her voice tight with panic, "we have to go. The driver says the highway is completely backed up. If we don't leave now, we'll miss the pre-show mic check." Julian did not look at her. He kept his eyes on me for 2 more seconds, searching my face for any sign of hesitation, any crack in my calm demeanor. He found nothing but the quiet, pale circles of the sliced apple on the cutting board. "Fine," he snapped, turning on his heel. "Let's go." He thrust his arms into the sleeves of the coat Genevieve held out for him. They moved quickly down the hall, the front door opening with a heavy creak and closing with a solid metallic thud that echoed through the empty house. I stood in the kitchen, the low hum of the morning news anchor's voice still filling the silence. I walked to the living room, picked up the remote control, and pressed the power button. The television screen died, leaving the room in a dark, peaceful quiet. I went back to the kitchen, took my keys from the hook, and picked up the white envelope I had prepared last night. It was addressed to the Central Archives of the State University Library, a formal donation agreement for my personal papers, research journals, and the handwritten manuscript drafts from the last 10 years. By donating them to the university's permanent collection under my maiden name, I was placing the physical proof of my authorship into a public, legally protected repository. Once cataloged, those files would be accessible to scholars, researchers, and critics. And Julian's publisher would no longer be able to claim that the work belonged solely to him. I slipped the envelope into my purse, opened the front door, and stepped out into the cool, quiet rain. The yellow receipt from the post office was warm from the high-speed thermal printer. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, the parking lot quiet around me, except for the dull, heavy patter of rain on the hood. I held the slip of paper between my fingers, feeling its thin, slick texture. My physical routine in these moments was automatic, a way to anchor my thoughts. I aligned the top edge of the receipt perfectly with the bottom, pressing my thumb along the fold until the crease was sharp and white. I folded it again, crosswise, ensuring the tracking number for the registered package was tucked safely inside. I unzipped the small, hidden compartment in the lining of my leather purse, slipped the paper inside, and pulled the zipper closed. The small metal pull clicked against the leather, a tiny, final sound. The package was officially on its way. It contained the formal deed of gift and the signed preliminary inventory of my papers, addressed directly to the director of the university library's special collections. I picked up my cardboard cup of black coffee from the cup holder. The steam rose in a thin, twisting column, condensing against the cold glass of the windshield. I took a slow sip. The coffee was cheap, bitter, and slightly burnt, but the heat of the cardboard cup was comforting against my damp palms. I turned my phone on. The screen illuminated the dim interior of the car with a flat blue glare. The notifications began to pile up, a rapid series of gentle vibrations against my thigh. There was an email from a Google alert I had set up years ago for Julian's name. It was a link to a local literary blog titled The Morning Slip. I tapped the link, my eyes scanning the short, biting paragraph written by a local arts journalist. Author Julian Vance appeared on Morning Heritage today to discuss his new novel, the blog read. But the segment took an awkward turn when host Sarah Jenkins asked about yesterday's architectural mix-up on public radio. Vance, looking visibly fatigued, blamed the error on a transcription oversight by his administrative staff. When Jenkins pointed out that Vance's historical research has historically been praiseworthy, and asked why his wife, long rumored to be his primary researcher, was absent from the book's acknowledgments, Vance stammered, offering a vague comment about his wife preferring the quiet of the home. The tension in the studio was palpable. I closed the browser. A second later, a text message from Marcus, Julian's agent, flashed on the screen. "Clara," Marcus wrote, "we need to talk, immediately, without Julian. Can you meet me at the cafe near the office at noon? I've just watched the Morning Heritage segment. It was a train wreck. Julian is behaving like a cornered animal, and his defense is falling apart. I need to know what is actually going on. Is there a draft of the next book or not?" I looked at the text, the blue light reflecting in the dark pool of my coffee. I calculated Marcus's motives. Marcus was not an academic. He was a literary broker. He did not care who wrote the sentences, as long as the sentences were delivered on time and could be sold to a major publishing house for 6 figures. He had spent years ignoring the obvious signs of my involvement because it was convenient for him to believe in the singular genius of Julian Vance. A singular genius was easier to market. A singular genius could do 5-city tours, charm wealthy patrons at wine tastings, and smile on morning television. Now that marketability was beginning to fray. If Julian failed to deliver the manuscript for the Glass Mirror by October 15th, the publisher would invoke the clawback clause. Marcus would lose his 15% commission, and his agency's reputation would take a hit. He wanted me to fix it. He wanted me to agree to a secret lunch where he could appeal to my loyalty, my sense of shared interest, or my financial security. He would ask me to quietly write the next 50 pages to get Julian through the summer press tour. I tapped the reply field. I typed a short, formal response. "Hello, Marcus. I have several commitments this afternoon and will be unable to meet. The files on the shared drive represent the entirety of the work currently available." I sent it. A second notification appeared. This one was from Julian. "Clara, we are on our way to Marcus's office now," his text read, the letters typed in a frantic, unpunctuated rush. "Marcus wants an emergency meeting before the afternoon press syndicate. You need to come down here. This is getting out of hand. I need you to be there to explain the research structures to the publicity director. They are threatening to scale back the promotional tour if we can't guarantee the second book outline is clean. Come to the office now." He was still commanding me. He was still using the word need as if it were a natural law, as if my primary purpose was to act as his administrative buffer. He did not ask how my morning was. He did not apologize for his anger from the night before or for the locked door. I did not reply to his text. I set the phone back in the cup holder. I started the car engine, the motor humming to life with a quiet, steady purr. I shifted the vehicle into drive and pulled out of the post office parking lot, turning away from the downtown business district where Marcus's office sat. I was not going to the publisher's office. I was driving toward the university campus, specifically the quiet red brick building that housed the Special Collections Archive. Tucked neatly in my trunk was a large, heavy cardboard box containing the physical evidence of 7 years of my work. The hand-drawn maps of the coastal villas, the genealogical charts of the character families, and the 300-page manuscript draft of Julian's first bestseller, entirely written in my small, precise handwriting. The rain continued to fall, the windshield wipers maintaining their steady, metronomic sweep. With each wipe of the glass, the path ahead grew a little clearer, the gray mist of the city fading into the background. The basement level of the university library was silent, insulated from the city's rain by 3 feet of reinforced concrete and a state-of-the-art climate control system. The air was dry, cool, and carried the sterile, slightly sweet scent of acid-free cardboard and ancient paper. It was a space designed entirely for preservation, where time was kept at a strict, frozen 62 degrees. I lifted the heavy cardboard box from the metal utility cart and placed it on the long oak counter of the Special Collections reading room. Dr. Helen Thorne, the head archivist, stood on the other side of the counter. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp graying hair cut into a neat bob and silver-rimmed reading glasses hanging from a blue silk cord around her neck. She wore a pair of thin white cotton gloves, her movements precise and deliberate as she reached into the box. My physical routine in this moment was quiet and methodical. I took a set of blue ink ballpoint pens from my bag and laid them side by side on the wood, aligning them with the edge of the desk. I pulled the 3 copies of the deed of gift from my portfolio, smoothing the heavy bond paper with the palm of my hand. Dr. Thorne lifted the first folder from the box. It was a thick, faded green folder containing the original handwritten manuscript of Julian's breakout novel, the one that had launched his career 7 years ago. She opened the cover. Inside, the pages were filled with small, sloping, precise handwriting, written in dark blue ink. The margin notes were extensive, detailing structural changes, character motivations, and historical references to 14th century trade routes. Dr. Thorne turned the page. She looked at the handwriting on the manuscript, then looked down at the signature line on the deed of gift I had placed before her. The handwriting on the legal document was identical to the handwriting on the 7-year-old manuscript. She did not gasp. She did not look surprised. An archivist of her experience had spent decades cataloging the secret, messy realities behind famous names. But her eyes softened behind her silver glasses, and she handled the yellowed pages with a quiet, almost reverent care. "This is an extraordinarily thorough record of the creative process, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice dropping to the hushed, respectful register of the reading room. "The entire structural progression of the narrative is documented here, from the initial outlines to the final corrections." "Yes," I said. I kept the records detailed. "And you are donating these materials under your maiden name, Clara Sterling?" she asked, her finger tracing the name printed on the deed. "Yes," I replied. The intellectual work, the research, and the physical drafting were completed entirely by me, prior to and during my marriage. The donation is made in my individual capacity. Dr. Thorne looked at the second item in the box, a small black leather notebook with a brass clasp. It was the notebook Julian had been screaming for only hours ago. She opened it to a page containing a meticulously hand-drawn map of a coastal Italian villa, complete with architectural elevations and a detailed timeline of the courtyard's construction. "This matches the setting of the new book," she murmured, correcting her pronoun before she fully uttered it. "It is the setting of my new book," I corrected her gently. Dr. Thorne nodded slowly, a small, subtle movement of her head that carried a wealth of unspoken understanding. She pulled her glasses down from her forehead and positioned them on the bridge of her nose. She took one of the blue pens from the counter. I calculated the legal weight of the signatures we were about to exchange. Once Dr. Thorne signed these deeds, the physical manuscripts, the research journals, and the original notebooks would become the permanent, unrestricted property of the university's Special Collections Department. They would be legally shielded from any domestic or marital claims. Under the university's charter, materials in the special collections could not be returned, destroyed, or altered by any donor or third party. If Julian's publisher or lawyers tried to dispute the authorship of the novels, the physical evidence would remain here, in a public, legally protected repository, catalogued under my maiden name. It was a spatial and legal vault that Julian's charm could not penetrate. Dr. Thorne signed the first copy of the deed, the metal nib of the pen making a dry, scratching sound against the heavy paper. She signed the second, then the third. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a heavy, red-handled rubber stamp. She pressed it onto the black ink pad, then brought it down onto the signature page with a firm, hollow thud. The ink was wet, a dark violet seal that read, "Received, University Special Collections." She pushed 2 of the signed copies across the counter to me. "We will begin the cataloging process immediately," she said. "Because of the contemporary interest in the work, I will assign our senior cataloger to the collection. The inventory should be fully digitized and accessible within 30 days. "Thank you, Helen," I said. "I appreciate your efficiency." "It is our duty to preserve the truth of the record, Mrs. Vance." "Miss Sterling," she corrected herself, with a polite, supportive smile. "The archive does not take sides. It simply keeps the evidence." I took the signed documents, folded them neatly, and slid them into my leather portfolio. I stood up, offering my hand across the counter. Her gloved hand was light and firm. I walked out of the reading room, the heavy oak doors closing silently behind us. I ascended the stone stairs to the main lobby, the quiet of the basement fading as the distant, energetic murmur of students and the clatter of keyboards in the computer lab filled the air. I walked out of the library's glass doors into the cool, gray afternoon. I sat in my car, the interior still smelling of the cheap black coffee I had finished earlier. I turned the key in the ignition. The phone in my purse immediately began to vibrate, a steady, frantic series of pulses that rattled against the leather lining. I pulled it out. There was a voicemail from Julian's agent, Marcus. "Clara," Marcus's voice said, his tone no longer professional or warm, but thin with a cold, desperate panic. "Julian just walked out of the meeting with the publicity director. He couldn't answer basic questions about the Chapter 4 timeline. He said you had the notes and were refusing to upload them. The publisher is threatening to suspend the remaining tour dates if we don't have a clean, verified outline for the second book by 5 p.m. Clara, I don't care about your domestic disputes. If you don't get down here with the files, we are looking at a breach of contract that will ruin all of us. Call me back. Now." I hung up the phone. I looked at the red brick facade of the library, its tall Gothic windows reflecting the gray sky. I shifted the car into drive and turned the steering wheel, heading back toward the quiet of Pinecrest Road. The house was cold when I returned. I stepped into the foyer, the quietness of the empty hallway wrapping around me like a heavy, damp blanket. I walked into the kitchen, set my keys on the counter, and turned on the small desk lamp in the corner of the room. The amber glow did little to warm the vast space, but it lit my workspace with a sharp, clean focus. I sat down and opened my laptop. My physical routine in this moment was precise, a digital cleaning of my borders. I opened the settings menu of my master email account, the account that controlled the shared cloud drive, our joint tax portals, and the secondary backups. I clicked on the Security tab. I navigated to the option labeled Active Sessions. On the screen, a list of devices appeared: my laptop, my phone, Julian's tablet, Julian's study desktop, and Genevieve's laptop. One by one, I clicked the button to log out of all other devices. With each click, a small gray prompt appeared on the screen, confirming the session had been terminated. I watched the names of their devices disappear from the list until only my laptop and my phone remained. Next, I changed the master password. I chose a long, complex string of numbers and letters that had no relation to our life, our marriage, or the books we had built together. It was a sterile, cold sequence. I then opened the local folder on my hard drive that synced with the shared Vance Manuscripts directory. I selected the folder labeled Future Drafts, which contained the initial 70 pages of The Glass Mirror and the complete historical timeline I had spent the winter constructing. I dragged the folder to the trash bin. The computer made a small, soft paper crumpling sound. I opened the trash bin, clicked empty, and watched the progress ring spin for 3 seconds before the window went completely blank. The digital door was officially locked. There was no longer a single byte of my work remaining on their devices or in their shared cloud. I closed my laptop and set it flat on the counter. I picked up my glass of water, taking a slow, cool sip. Outside, the rain had intensified, the drops striking the large glass sliding doors of the patio with a heavy, irregular rattle. The sky had turned a dark, bruised purple, the late afternoon light fading quickly into the shadows of the garden. At 3:45, my phone began to vibrate on the counter. It was a voice message from Julian, sent through an encrypted messaging app. I pressed my thumb to the screen, playing the audio. "Clara," Julian's voice said. He was panting slightly, his tone carrying a desperate, high-pitched strain that I had never heard before. He had abandoned his academic baritone entirely. "Clara, please. Marcus says the publisher is serious. They are talking about suspending the contract. They want to audit the research files because of what happened on Morning Heritage. They think there's a problem with the authenticity of the material. Genevieve says you must have the local synced folder. Just drag and drop the files back. Please, we can fix this. I've talked to Marcus. We can rewrite the dedication page for the second printing. I'll make sure your name is first in the acknowledgments. I'll tell the publicist we are a co-writing team. Just upload the files, Clara. We have 80 minutes before the deadline." I listened to the recording twice. The offer was magnificent in its hollow generosity. He was offering to share the credit for the book I had written, to grant me a line in the acknowledgments of my own work, and to rewrite a dedication page he had given to another woman, all in exchange for me saving his career for the 3rd time in 48 hours. He still believed this was a negotiation. He still believed my withdrawal was an emotional reaction, a wife's petulant demand for attention that could be bought off with a public nod and a co-writing credit. He was entirely blind to the legal deeds currently resting in the university library vaults. I calculated his desperation. In 80 minutes, the publisher's 5 o'clock deadline would pass. If the files were not uploaded, the publicity campaign would be frozen, and the legal team at Marcus & Sterling would begin the process of reviewing the contract for a material breach. Julian would have to return the $75,000 signing advance, funds that were no longer in our joint account, as I had quietly transferred my personal share of the trust disbursements to my individual account during my visit to the bank. He would be financially and professionally ruined. I did not reply. I deleted the voice message and placed my phone in the zippered pocket of my purse. I stood up, walked to the hall closet, and pulled out a small, dark blue canvas bag, the one I used for weekend trips to my sister's house in the country. I walked to the guest room, opened the closet, and began to pack. My physical routine of packing was quiet. I folded 3 cashmere sweaters, 2 pairs of dark trousers, and my sturdiest walking shoes. I placed my toiletries in a small leather case and set them on top of the clothes. I did not take anything that Julian had bought for me. I took only the things I had brought into the marriage and the books that belonged to my grandmother. By 4:45, the low, wet crunch of tires on gravel sounded from the driveway. I stood by the guest room window, pulling back the thin white curtain. Through the rain-streaked glass, I watched Genevieve's silver hatchback pull up to the front steps. The headlights cut out, leaving the car in the gray dark of the storm. For 3 long minutes, neither of them got out. I could see the pale silhouettes of their heads through the windshield, their faces turned toward each other, their shoulders tense. They were arguing, or perhaps they were simply sitting in the quiet of their shared failure, realizing that the clock had nearly run out. Then the car doors opened. Julian stepped out into the rain, his wool coat draped loosely over his shoulders like a discarded shroud. He did not run. He walked slowly up the stone steps, his head bowed against the downpour, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Genevieve followed a step behind him, clutching her wet portfolio to her chest, her shoulders shaking under her thin jacket. I closed the curtain. I picked up my blue canvas bag, walked out of the guest room, and stood in the quiet hallway, waiting for the front door to open. The heavy brass latch of the front door clicked, and a cold gust of wind swept into the foyer, bringing with it the sharp, clean smell of wet concrete and autumn leaves. Julian stepped inside. His hair was completely ruined by the rain, plastering in dark, uneven clumps against his forehead. He did not remove his coat. He stood on the entry mat, water dripping from his hem onto the white oak floorboards in a steady, rhythmic tap. Genevieve followed him, her face pale and pinched. She looked down at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes, her fingers clutching her wet leather portfolio so tightly her knuckles were white. They both froze when they saw me standing at the foot of the stairs. I was wearing my trench coat. My blue canvas travel bag sat on the floor beside my feet. My physical routine in this moment was slow and deliberate. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my black leather driving gloves. I slid my left hand into the glove, smoothing the soft leather down each finger, ensuring the seams aligned perfectly. I repeated the process with my right hand, then reached down to press the small brass snap at my wrist. The click of the metal was tiny, but incredibly clear in the tense, silent room. "Where do you think you're going?" Julian asked. His voice was hoarse, stripped of all its theatrical polish. It sounded thin, like dry paper scraping over wood. "I am going to my sister's house," I said, my voice remaining perfectly level. Julian took 3 rapid steps forward, his wet shoes leaving dark, messy tracks across the floorboards. "Clara, are you insane?" He stopped 2 feet from me, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Look at the clock. It is 5 minutes to 5. The publisher is waiting. Marcus is waiting." Genevieve stepped closer, her voice trembling. Clara, the shared drive is completely locked. I tried to upload the outline from the station, but it kept saying my access was denied. I thought there was a server error, but then I tried to log in on my phone, and it said my credentials had been revoked. We can't access anything. I changed the passwords, I said. Julian's chest rose and fell in a heavy, violent heave. He stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, a strange, desperate red rimming his pupils. You did what? I terminated the sessions, I said. The shared drive is closed. You can't do that, Julian shouted, his voice cracking, echoing sharply off the high plaster walls of the foyer. He raised his hand as if to grab my shoulder, but my quiet, unblinking gaze seemed to stop him mid-air. His hand hovered, trembling, before dropping back to his side. That folder contains my manuscript, my book. The glass mirror is under contract with my publisher. You are withholding my professional property, Clara. That is a crime. I calculated the legal and physical space of the room. Julian was standing directly between me and the front door, his broad shoulders blocking the entryway. To my right, the grandfather clock was ticking, the brass pendulum swinging back and forth with a dry, mechanical tick-tock that was the only steady rhythm left in the house. He was threatening me. He was standing in the house my grandmother's trust had purchased, wearing a suit paid for by the advances of books I had written, calling my 18 months of labor his professional property. He was threatening me with the very lawyers and publishers I had spent the morning legally neutralizing. He had crossed the final line. The last thread of our shared illusion was gone. It is not your book, Julian, I said softly. Julian let out a sharp, ugly laugh, his face twisting in a sneer of pure, desperate arrogance. My name is on the contract, Clara. My name is on the copyright of every single volume. The law doesn't care about your little midnight editing sessions. If you walk out that door with those files, I will have Marcus file an immediate injunction. The publisher's legal team will sue you for everything you have. You will be left with nothing. Do you understand me? Nothing. I looked past him to Genevieve. She was staring at Julian, her mouth slightly open. She looked horrified, not by me, but by the raw, venomous desperation spilling out of the man she had believed was a gentle, brilliant scholar. The romantic illusion of the literary genius was rotting in front of her, replaced by a small, vindictive man screaming threats at his wife in a wet hallway. I looked back at Julian. I did not raise voice. I did not defend my work or remind him of the hours I had spent bleeding over his sentences while he slept. It is exactly 5 o'clock, I said. Behind him, the heavy weights of the grandfather clock dropped with a soft, mechanical click. The first deep chime of the 5 o'clock hour began, the heavy brass bell ringing out through the empty house, vibrating through the floorboards beneath our feet. 1. Julian looked at the clock, then back at me, his face suddenly turning a pale ash gray. He knew what the chime meant. The publisher's deadline had just passed. The link was empty. The upload portal was closed. 2. You've ruined me, he whispered, his voice dropping to a hollow, dry wheeze. 3. I reached down and picked up my blue canvas travel bag, my gloved fingers gripping the heavy fabric handle. 4. Please step aside, Julian, I said. 5. The final chime died away, leaving only the slow, steady tick-tock of the pendulum in the quiet hallway. Julian stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on my leather gloves, before his shoulders slowly slumped. He stepped to the side, his wet coat dragging against the white wall, leaving a long, damp smear on the plaster. I walked past him. I opened the front door, stepping out into the cool, dark rain, and did not look back. The state route winding through the pine woods was entirely dark, save for the twin yellow beams of my headlights cutting through the heavy silver sheets of rain. The tires made a deep, watery hiss against the asphalt, a sound that rose and fell as the car climbed the narrow hills toward my sister's property. I kept my speed at a steady 30 miles per hour, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. 2 miles past the county line, I pulled the car into a small, gravel-strewn scenic turnout overlooking the swollen river below. I shifted the transmission into park, but I did not turn off the headlights. They illuminated the thick, wet trunks of the pines and the wild, swirling mist rising from the gorge. My physical routine in this moment was slow, a quiet transition from driver to spectator. I reached down with my right hand and unsnapped the brass fastener at my left wrist. I gripped the tip of the glove's middle finger, pulling slowly, feeling the tight, warm leather slide over my skin until my hand was bare. I repeated the process for my right hand. I smoothed the leather of each glove, aligned them side by side, and folded them into a neat, compact square. I opened the glove compartment, placed them inside on top of the car's registration folder, and closed the door with a soft plastic click. The silence inside the cabin was thick, interrupted only by the drumming of the storm against the steel roof. I picked up my phone from the center console. The screen was a bright, flat blue in the dark car, showing 47 unread messages and 12 missed calls. Most were from Marcus, his name appearing in a relentless, desperate column. But near the top of the screen, the notifications from Genevieve were different. They were short, frantic, and stripped of the professional deference she had maintained for 6 months. 5:12 p.m. Clara, please, he is screaming. He is throwing the books from the shelves. 5:25 p.m. He broke the study window. He threw the heavy brass lamp. There is glass all over the floor. He says I am a parasite. He says I ruined his career because I didn't verify the cloud sync. 5:40 p.m. I am locked in the downstairs guest room bathroom. He is pounding on the door. He wants my laptop. He says my credentials must still have a back door. Clara, please call him. Tell him I didn't touch the files. Tell him you locked the drive. I stared at the messages, the blue light casting long, cold shadows across the dashboard. I calculated the speed of his collapse. Without me acting as the silent shock absorber, the entirety of Julian's frustration, panic, and absolute helplessness was hitting Genevieve directly. The romantic illusion of his genius, the quiet nights of poetry, the flattering dedications, it had all dissolved in less than an hour. He had treated Genevieve as his muse when the sun was shining. But now that the stage was dark and the storm had breached the walls, he was treating her like an incompetent servant who had let his crown fall into the mud. I also calculated the immediate tactical opportunity. If I ignored the text, Genevieve might eventually give him her laptop, or he might break down the door. But if I intervened directly, I would be drawn back into the machinery of his crisis. I opened the phone's keypad. I did not call Julian. I did not call Genevieve. I dialed the non-emergency number for the county sheriff's department, the station located 3 miles from our house on Pinecrest Road. County dispatch, a calm, flat female voice, answered after the second ring. "Hello," I said, my voice remaining entirely steady, matching the low hum of the car's heater fan. "I would like to request a welfare check at 12 Pinecrest Road. There is a severe domestic disturbance in progress. A male resident is destroying property, breaking glass, and a young woman is currently locked in a room, fearing for her safety." "Do you know the name of the resident, ma'am?" the dispatcher asked, her typing keyboard clicking softly in the background. "His name is Julian Vance," I said. "He is a prominent local author." "Understood. We have a unit patrolling the ridge. They will be there in 5 minutes. Are you at the scene, ma'am?" "No," I said. "I am currently traveling. Thank you." I hung up the phone. I calculated the fallout of that call. The local sheriff's department was small, and their daily logs were public record, monitored closely by the regional journalists who covered the university town. By tomorrow morning, the record of a domestic disturbance and a police dispatch to the home of best-selling author Julian Vance on the very day of his book launch would be on the desks of the local editors. The public veneer would not just crack, it would shatter completely. And it would be documented, verified, and entirely of his own making. I set the phone back in the center console. I shifted the car into drive, turned the steering wheel, and pulled back onto the dark, wet asphalt of the state route. The headlights illuminated the winding path ahead, the yellow lines reflecting brightly through the dark pines. My sister's house was still 20 miles away. It was a quiet place, surrounded by high wooden fences and the deep, silent woods. There would be no phones ringing, no frantic emails, and no screaming men pounding on locked doors. I adjusted the heater, letting the warm air blow across my bare fingers, and drove into the night. The cedar cabin sat at the end of a long, unpaved logging road, its dark shingle siding blending seamlessly with the shadows of the surrounding hemlocks. I turned off the car headlights. The sudden, absolute darkness of the woods rushed in, leaving only the soft, irregular drumming of the rain on the windshield. I stepped out of the car, carrying my blue canvas bag. The air here was thin, cold, and smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. I walked up the 3 wooden steps to the porch. My physical routine in this moment was grounding, a return to simple, tangible actions. I reached into my purse, pulled out the heavy brass key my sister had left for me in our shared deposit box years ago, and inserted it into the old iron padlock on the screen door. The lock turned with a dry, stiff grind, the metal latch sliding open with a heavy click. I stepped inside, closed the heavy wooden inner door behind me, and turned the deadbolt. The cabin was cold, but it was dry. It smelled faintly of aged pine, wax polish, and the sweet herbal scent of dried lavender bundles hanging from the exposed rafters. I did not turn on the overhead electric lights. Instead, I walked to the stone hearth in the corner of the living room. I knelt on the rough wool rug. I stacked 2 dry birch logs at the base of the grate. I took a sheet of old newspaper from the basket, crumpled it into a tight ball, and tucked it beneath the wood. On top of the paper, I laid a handful of dry pine kindling I had brought from the porch. I struck a long wooden match against the stone hearth. The sulfur scent of the match was sharp, followed immediately by the bright yellow flare of the flame. I held the match to the edge of the newspaper, watching the fire catch and begin to crawl slowly through the dry kindling. I sat back on my heels, watching the small orange sparks rise into the dark chimney. The wood began to crackle, a warm, lively sound that broke the deep silence of the cabin. I stood up, walked to the small bedroom, and unpacked my blue bag. I hung my trench coat in the cedar wardrobe, placed my toiletries on the wooden shelf in the small bathroom, and set my 3 books on the nightstand. I went back to the living room, sat in the high-backed wooden rocking chair near the fire, and pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen lit up. The notifications had continued to pile up, but the tone of the messages had shifted. The first was a text from a local contact, a research librarian at the university who subscribed to the county police scanners. "Clara," the text read, "did something happen at the house? The scanner just reported 2 sheriff's units dispatched to 12 Pinecrest Road for a domestic disturbance and a psychiatric welfare check. They said a male resident was being transported." The second message was from Genevieve. It had been sent at 7:15 p.m. "Clara, I am so sorry," she wrote. "The police came. Julian was out of control. When the deputies arrived, he was trying to break through the bathroom door. He started screaming at them, telling them they were part of a conspiracy to steal his intellectual property. They had to restrain him. They've taken him to the county hospital for a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation. I am at the motel near the highway. I've left the key on the kitchen counter. I'm sending a formal letter of resignation to Marcus tomorrow morning. I cannot do this anymore. I am so sorry." I looked at the text. I calculated the precise geometry of his ruin. By tomorrow morning, Marcus would receive Genevieve's resignation letter. The publisher would realize that there was no outline, no manuscript, and no research files to audit. The television affiliate would cancel his remaining segments, citing the domestic disturbance and his hospitalization. The legal team at Marcus and Sterling would begin the process of contract termination and clawback. And Julian would be entirely alone in a sterile hospital room, his charm useless against the quiet, unyielding machinery of the law and his own documented collapse. He had believed that his name on the cover of the books was the only thing that mattered. He had believed that the silent labor of his wife was a natural resource, as free and inexhaustible as tap water. He had only realized the value of the well when the tap ran completely dry. And now there was no way to refill it. The physical evidence of my authorship was locked in the university archive vaults under my maiden name, permanently out of his reach. The digital files were gone. The Muse had fled, terrified by the reality of the beast behind the mask. I felt no triumph. I felt no surge of bitter joy. I felt only a profound, cool stillness, like the deep water of a lake after a long storm has passed. The ledger was finely balanced. I set the phone face down on the small wooden table next to the rocking chair. I reached out and picked up my book, an old leather-bound volume of historical essays I had taken from my grandmother's library. I opened the cover. The paper was thick, smelling of old leather and vanilla. I began to read, my eyes tracing the clean black letters on the cream-colored pages. Outside, the rain continued to fall, a soft, steady whisper in the dark woods. But inside, the fire roared, throwing long, warm shadows across the quiet cedar walls. The morning light was pale and cool, filtering through the thick pine boughs outside the bedroom window to paint long gray stripes across the wooden floor. I woke to the absolute silence of the woods, a quiet so deep that the soft, rhythmic rustle of the wind through the hemlocks sounded like a distant wave washing over sand. I stood up, pulled on my heavy wool cardigan, and walked into the small kitchen. My physical routine was slow and deliberate, a quiet meditation in the early light. I took the copper kettle to the sink, filled it with cold water from the pump, and set it on the small gas burner. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small tin of loose jasmine green tea leaves. I measured exactly 2 teaspoons of the leaves into the small, dark clay teapot. When the kettle whistled, a thin, steady reed of sound that cut through the quiet cabin, I turned off the flame. I waited precisely 60 seconds for the water to cool slightly, then poured it over the leaves. I watched them rise, unfurl, and slowly sink to the bottom of the clay pot, turning the water a pale, clear amber. I carried my tea to the wooden table near the window and sat down. I opened my laptop and connected it to my phone's cellular hotspot. The connection was slow, the signal indicator showing only 2 bars, but it was enough. I opened the local newspaper's website. On the lower half of the homepage, a small headline caught my eye. Local author hospitalized after Pinecrest Road incident. The article was brief, written with the dry, cautious language of legal reporting. It stated that sheriff's deputies had responded to a domestic disturbance call at the home of best-selling novelist Julian Vance, where they observed extensive property damage. The article noted that a young female associate had been escorted from the premises safely, and that Vance had been taken into custody under a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation hold. I closed the browser tab. My face in the dark reflection of the screen was completely calm, my eyes untroubled. I opened my email inbox. There was a single long email from Clara Sterling. It had been sent at 8:45. Clara, the email began, the text stripped of his usual dramatic flourishes and exclamation points. It is over. The publisher has formally canceled the remaining tour dates for The Whispering Tide. They have issued a formal notice of contract suspension for The Glass Mirror and are demanding the immediate return of the $75,000 signing advance. Genevieve sent me her formal resignation this morning. She has retained a lawyer and is threatening to go to the press about the hostile environment at the house. Julian is currently under a medical hold at the county facility and is completely unreachable. The text continued, the font shifting slightly, as if Marcus had stopped, paced around his desk, and then returned to type with a frantic, desperate intensity. Clara, please, I know the truth. I've known for years that you were the one doing the heavy lifting, but we all played along because it worked. If you have the files for The Glass Mirror, We can fix this. I have spoken with the editorial director. If you deliver the manuscript, they are willing to contract the book directly to you. We will put your name on the cover as sole author. We will pay you the full advance. You will get the credit you deserve, Clara. Just send me the files. Tell me your terms. I will draft the new agreement today. I sat perfectly still, holding the clay tea mug between my palms, feeling the dry heat of the ceramic seep into my skin. I calculated his desperation. Marcus still believed this was a matter of negotiation. He believed that my 7 years of silence had been a long, simmering negotiation for credit, money, and recognition. He thought that by offering to put my name on the cover, by offering to pay me the advance, he could simply slide me into the slot Julian had vacated, and the machinery of the publishing house would continue to turn without a hitch. He did not understand that the work was no longer for sale. He did not understand the nature of the archive I had established. By formally donating the physical manuscripts, the hand-drawn maps, the genealogical charts, and the original handwritten drafts of every single book to the university's special collections under my maiden name, I had placed the physical proof of my authorship into a public, legally protected repository. If Marcus or the publisher tried to publish any portion of The Glass Mirror under Julian's name, or even under mine through their existing contract, they would be committing a clear, verifiable copyright infringement against an active collection held by a state institution. The manuscripts were no longer commercial property. They were historical records. I set my tea mug down on the wooden table. The clay made a soft, hollow click against the pine. I clicked the reply button. I typed a single, cold paragraph. Marcus, I wrote. The original drafts, research journals, and structural outlines for all works, including the preliminary materials for The Glass Mirror, have been donated to the university's special collections under my maiden name, Clara Sterling. The collection is unrestricted for academic research, but legally protected from commercial exploitation. I have no files to sell, and I have no terms to negotiate. I clicked Send. The progress bar on the screen flickered for a second before the message disappeared into the outgoing folder. I closed my laptop, slid it into its leather case, and shut the lid. The cabin returned to its deep, cool silence. I picked up my mug, taking a slow sip of the green tea. It was warm, grassy, and completely clean, leaving no bitter aftertaste. Outside, the mist was slowly rising from the small clearing, exposing the tall, dark trunks of the hemlocks and the wet green moss covering the stones. The 6 weeks that followed my departure from Pinecrest Road had been the quietest of my life. It was now late October, and the relentless autumn rain had finally cleared, leaving behind a sky of pale, brilliant blue and a crisp, biting cold that made the breath plume in white clouds. I walked down the main cobblestone path of the university campus, my leather boots crunching softly over the dry, fallen maple leaves. The morning sun was low, casting long golden shadows across the stone arches of the academic buildings. In my right hand, I held a warm paper cup of cinnamon tea, the steam rising from the lid to warm the tip of my nose. My physical routine on this crisp morning was slow, entirely free of the invisible, frantic labor that had dictated my days for nearly 10 years. I did not have a schedule to print. I did not have emails to manage for another person. I did not have a lecture to prepare or a messy draft to reconstruct. I stopped at a stone bench overlooking the main quad, sat down, and pulled a fresh, leather-bound notebook from my purse. It was a deep, forest green leather, entirely blank, smelling of clean oil and new paper. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a physical letter I had received yesterday from my attorney, Arthur Croft. I unfolded the heavy cream paper with steady, slow movements of my fingers, smoothing the creases flat against my knee. The legal resolution had been swift and absolute. The divorce decree was finalized. The house on Pinecrest Road, purchased entirely by my grandmother's trust, remained mine. Julian's legal team had tried to assert a claim over the property, arguing his literary success had contributed to its value, but Arthur had presented the trust documents and the property tax receipts. The claim had been dismissed by the judge in less than 10 minutes. More importantly, Julian's financial partition was complete. He had been forced to return the $75,000 signing advance to Marcus and Sterling. Since the joint account had been split, the remaining portion of that debt fell solely on him. To pay it, Julian had been forced to sell his luxury sedan, his extensive collection of rare first editions, and his shares in the regional academic journal. He had been released from the county psychiatric facility after his 72-hour hold, but the damage was irreversible. The local police blotter report of his domestic incident and the subsequent welfare check had been picked up by the regional papers. The headline had been small but devastating. Best-selling author Julian Vance had been exposed, not as a gentle, solitary genius, but as a hostile, desperate fraud who had tried to break down a locked door in his own home. Genevieve had gone back to her home state. Her formal resignation had been accompanied by a detailed statement from her lawyer, which Marcus had used to convince the publisher to drop the threatened fraud lawsuit in exchange for a quiet, mutual termination of all contracts. She was no longer a muse. She was simply a young woman recovering from a heavy, painful illusion. And Julian? He was now living in a small, third-floor studio apartment near the industrial tracks on the edge of town. His desk was empty. His screen was blank. The publisher had clawed back his titles, and without my quiet background mind to organize his thoughts, he was completely unable to produce a single page of prose. He had finally discovered that his genius was not a natural resource he owned, but a voice he had borrowed, and the voice had walked out the door. I folded Arthur's letter and slipped it back into my purse. I stood up, walked across the quad, and entered the tall, arched wooden doors of the university library. The lobby was warm, smelling of wood polish, old paper, and the soft hum of the central heating. I descended the stone stairs to the basement level, walking toward the quiet reading room of the Special Collections Department. Near the entrance, behind a heavy glass display case, was the first official installation of the new academic archive. I stopped in front of the glass, looking at the display. Inside the case, lying open under a soft, low-voltage amber light, was the faded green folder containing the original handwritten manuscript of Julian's first bestseller, The Ash Garden. The pages were open to Chapter 3, showing the precise, sloping, blue ink handwriting that matched the signature on the acquisition deed. Beside the folder was the small black leather notebook with the brass clasp, its hand-drawn maps of the Italian coast laid out for researchers to see. On the wooden plaque beside the case, a clean brass card had been mounted. It read, "The Clara Sterling Archive. The creative records, research, and manuscript drafts of the author. Gift of Clara Sterling, 2026." A young graduate student was standing in front of the glass, a notepad in her hand, studying the handwriting with intense, silent concentration. She looked at the manuscript, then at the brass plaque, her eyes wide with a quiet academic reverence. She did not know I was standing right behind her. She did not know that the woman who had lived in the shadows of those books was now standing in the light. I turned and walked back up the stone stairs, stepping out of the library into the bright, crisp afternoon. I returned to my stone bench on the quad. I opened my green leather notebook to the very first page. It was a beautiful, blindingly clean, white, blank page. I unscrewed the cap of my gold fountain pen, touched the metal nib to the paper, and began to write. I wrote the first sentence of my first novel under my own name, Clara Sterling. The words came slowly, but they were my own. They were clean, precise, and entirely free of another man's shadow. If this story reminded you that families should never take love, sacrifice, and dedication for granted, you are not alone. Sometimes the quietest people carry the heaviest burdens, and the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to stop carrying the weight of those who do not respect your mind or your soul. What would you have done in Clara's position? Would you have stayed to protect the brand and the marriage? Or would you have walked away to reclaim your voice and your dignity? Share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this long-form psychological drama and want to support more meaningful stories about resilience, betrayal, second chances, and the quiet power of truth, please consider subscribing. It helps